Welcome to The Antidote. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Rothkushow.
Jeremy, there's about probably 100 different topics we could, and subtopics we could discuss in our 58 minutes here. We got to make the best of the time we have, and I guess we've limited it, I guess, to two major topics today, and it's going to be fun to try and make sense of this. It's going to be a very, I think, reading heavy show. I know you're going to be reading a lot today from a couple of different books, and as we go along, I'll provide commentary and chime in with comments as I feel necessary during the course of this. But I guess we're going to start out this week. Did you want to start out by playing this video regarding Jeffrey Epstein and flights in and out of Teterboro Airport in New Jersey?
Yes, and we'll then attempt to link this to the meta-analysis that we started last week in terms of the nuclear Epstein analysis, and that they're behind the scenes here, behind all of the media frenzy around the salacious details and the question of whether Ghislaine Maxwell's picture at the Southern California In-N-Out is a hoax, or it was staged, or if it's, whatever all that means, or the salacious details of where she's staying with and who's her boyfriend, or all that type of thing. Behind the scenes there, this is about the highest levels of technology and how it relates to organized crime, oligarchy, and state security power. And that I think that we can really begin to see an arc here, especially in relationship to the Israeli state security apparatus, where we are aware of how interested they were in the nuclear option, in having the nuclear option at their disposal. And we know of the history of LACOM, the Bureau of Scientific Relations, started by people like Shimon Peres, a scientist named Bloomberg, and then they employed people like the super spy producer Arnon Milchan, who maybe we'll touch back on later on. And that was all around the nuclear aspect. And of course, there's even aspects of the Promise software, or the enhanced Promise software, enhanced with inclusive of an Israeli backdoor, the insertion of that into the heart of the U.S. nuclear weapons apparatus via Sandia, questions about Los Alamos. There is this then intersection, and then ultimately, I believe, a transition from the nuclear option still on the table to this question of high technology and the cyber question, the Talpiot question of the 21st century, the post 9/11 era, where I believe there will still be lots of money made from nuclear architecture, and maybe tactical nuclear weapons will be still be a threat of them to be used in terroristic ways, as they apparently have been in the last decades around the world in different places. But more and more, the question will be about high technology, about the cyber domain, and I think that's what we're going to be able to see in the background here if we trace some of even these mainstream news reportings about where in the world is Ghislaine Maxwell. So we'll play some of that.
All right, so you want to pull up this clip, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, so this is a CBS News clip titled "Court Documents Say Teterboro Airport Was Travel Hub for Epstein's Alleged Sex Trafficking." So I'm going to play about 2 minutes of this, and maybe we'll jump in there a little bit.
Okay, sounds good.
So we're learning new details about how Jeffrey Epstein and his associates allegedly transported young women through his network of sexual...
They're still calling it young women. I even noticed, like, in the Robbie and Abby Martin did a long podcast about Epstein, and they're sort of like catching up at some level in terms of how serious this thing is and how real the intelligence, that this is not just sort of anti-Semitic conspiracy theorists who some of us have been asserting for years, that the connection to intelligence, especially Israeli intelligence, is very obvious it's definitely obvious enough to assert as an analyst. But even then, like Abby was warning Robbie of using underage women. I know I've done it before, and I think that we do need to make sure that these are girls, underage girls, and not to weaponize and run cover for these operations by calling them underage women.
That's a great point, and I think Abby and some other people within her circles are starting to have to address certain realities that maybe they wanted to dismiss before because it was too conspiratorial or too much of the discrediting conspiratorial type of stuff. But anyway, I digress, and so let's get into it.
And it was interesting because Robbie was like acknowledging that Abby was right about that, and then he kept doing it, and then she wouldn't confront him, sort of like the way that I do confront you sometimes about the spears or the spheres. Okay, exactly. I digress way too much. I'm going to focus, Greg. Here we go.
Let's get this clip going.
Abuse. The North Jersey Record reports that flight logs obtained in the investigation into Epstein show New Jersey's Teterboro Airport was a travel hub for the disgraced financier's sex trafficking ring. And according to statements from court filings, Epstein allegedly frequented the small airport to deliver dozens of underage girls to his rich friends, including royals and politicians. Some were as young as 14. So for more on this, we want to bring in the writer of that article from the New Jersey Record, columnist Chris Magg. It's Magg, right? Mogg? Okay. Sure. Thank you very much for joining us, Chris. So for people who are not in this section of the country, in the Northeast, they may not be familiar with Teterboro Airport. It's not a very big airport.
No, not at all. It is located 12 miles west of New York City, of Manhattan. It's in a floodplain. And what's important to know about Teterboro Airport is that because of its location so close to Manhattan, it's one of the favored destinations for some of the wealthiest people on Earth, celebrities. Whenever they need to come and go from New Jersey and New York, many of them live in our area in northern New Jersey. That's how we know about it. Mm-hmm. You have to get across the river.
And remember, this is also the area, Bergen County, that did some of the reporting. The original reporting on the arrests of the celebrating Mossad guys, and it's from that area. So,
yeah, and also Teterboro Airport is basically run by the New Jersey Port Authority, which makes sense considering that it's within their area of governance, but also when you consider the people that were basically running the show, certainly at the time of September 11th, and I'm sure since then at the New York Port Authority, it becomes possibly something much more interesting when you consider all of the machinations there, and then the significant Epstein connection to this particular airport. So.
Yeah, and I'll play some more of this, but I want to follow on that with that there still are a couple interesting questions that should be looked into and researched, and one is I think I mentioned it before, that the actual flight records of Epstein in the run-up to September 11th and maybe surrounding September 11th, and see what that may indicate. And I know that I floated a hypothesis last week of that he may be involved in this 9/11 operation, that he may not even know necessarily what he's trucking on his covert plane runs. But obviously there will tie in more later on that will say that there was very light, what you would call security in relationship to import-export aspects, customs in terms of private planes that went through Teterboro. So the perfect kind of place to be smuggling both humans but also weapons, I would say. And then the other question still is, you pointed out very correctly that the Port Authority of New York, New Jersey, of course, involved in the privatization of the World Trade Center in the run-up to September 11th. We've dealt with all of that. Interesting, I think, show that we did on there was Trump's Ground Zero, where it was focused around Howard Lorber and some of the real estate's connections surrounding the bidding for the World Trade Center. But it actually, I think I saw a comment from someone who looked it up that Howard Lutnick, we'd found that Howard Lorber was Chabad of some part of Long Island, and it turns out that Howard Lutnick from last week, from Cantor Fitzgerald, the neighbor, the close neighbor to Jeffrey Epstein, is also Long Island Chabad. So these circles are tight, and I just want to say that yes, you're correct. Port Authority, New York, New Jersey, is the sort of supervisor or the manager of Teterboro Airport, but I believe that there's probably a private security contractor there who's responsible for security, sort of similarly to the way that companies like Kroll were responsible for quote-unquote security on September 11th, that we might want to look into. And I just want to mention this name in case I forget later, that if you go look to New Mexico and the network surrounding Zorro Ranch and Epstein there and Bill Richardson there, there's a company called AKAL, A-K-A-L, that was started by Yogi Bhajan, actually. Some people would call him a pseudo-Sikh. Sikhs, like in India, would sort of say that he'd ripped off Sikhism and used it to create a sort of Kundalini yoga cult for the West. And I have some background with that maybe I'll share at another time, that was very interesting in relationship to my perception of Yogi Bhajan. But the network analysis of it is that James Jesus Angleton's two of his daughters were involved with Yogi Bhajan and were high level in terms of helping set up his infrastructure, both in terms of the yoga, but also these other businesses that are really spin-offs. And this is quite a spin-off, AKAL Security, over $1 billion in federal security contracts for even I think they're involved with potential nuclear installations, airports, U.S. Air Force bases, all of that. And Angleton himself, James Jesus Angleton, was said to have been close with Yogi Bhajan, who counted even Governor Bill Richardson as a devotee, and who they were very, very close. And so I think there's an interesting connection there. So I just wanted to float that. I'm not sure, and I actually doubt that they are the security group at Teterboro, but I think it would be very important to find out who the private security contractor at Teterboro Airport actually is and or was, especially surrounding September 11th. So I'll finish this clip.
Great points.
Which is sometimes difficult. But once you do that, it's right there, and it's the easiest, quickest way to escape the traffic in LaGuardia and JFK and get out of the area.
Okay, so tell me about these flight logs. What are we learning?
Sure. So the flight logs encompass 150 pages of very small print with thousands of flights.
30 flights.
What we're learning is that there were 730 flights by Jeffrey Epstein's multiple airplanes. He had up to 6 pilots at any one time. And he would fly most commonly between Teterboro Airport, New York area, and Palm Beach International, where he had one of his mansions. Other common destinations include his Zorro Ranch in New Mexico. He also flew a lot to Europe.
Okay, I'm going to stop it there, and I'm just going to point out that they're reporting on a graph that they've put up on the screen, Epstein's flights to and from Teterboro, that tracks the percentages of flights to these destinations. And as they said, Palm Beach, Florida was the highest at 44.6%. Other destinations were 22.44%. The Virgin Islands were up above 15%, meaning like St. Thomas, his Lolita Island. But then Santa Fe, New Mexico is at almost 5%, and that's Zorro Ranch, of course. That's the Sandia Lab area. That's Bill Richardson area. That's a King Ranch area down there. But below that, 3% is Columbus, Ohio, right? That's Les Wexnerville. That's potentially Iran-Contraville. That's Southern Air Transport, formerly over in that area. There's a mob connection there. But then what they missed mentioning here, which is actually it's twice as much as Epstein's trips to Santa Fe, New Mexico, and Zorro Ranch, is Bedford, Massachusetts, at 9.7%. And I think some of these trips probably can be explained by what's known overtly on the record about his relationship with places like Harvard University, the MIT, the Media Lab there. Now people are having to come out with apologies from MIT Media Lab. Some people are leaving, and then people have floated the question of Aaron Schwartz I believe George Webb actually floated that Aaron Swartz was probably even paraded around in some of these circles. So that puts a whole nother layer on top of the question of Aaron Swartz's open sourcing work that he did and his alleged suicide and all of that. But I would say then there's a even deeper background there to these trips to Bedford, Massachusetts, which is, a small airport that keeps you outside of the bigger Boston metro area, but it puts you at the epicenter of Boston high technology, right? And Bedford, Mass is near the Hanscom Air Force Base, and there people can go look at people like James Perloff, and I believe Christopher Bolin has reported about this specific area and how this might even have tied into September 11th. There's even questions about MITRE Corporation and the cyber hijacking aspect, the super user hijacking aspect of the FAA and NORAD in relationship to September 11th. But even in a more general factor, there's a question of this Route 128, I think it is, that is seen as the other side of Silicon Valley. Basically, it's the East Coast Silicon Valley. It's Boston centric. It's sort of the west of Boston, and it's very heavily Israeli for many, many years back. And so then moving into what we were mentioning earlier about the question of where in the world is Ghislaine Maxwell. It was being reported in, I believe, the Telegraph. Is that correct, Greg?
Not sure exactly what. I'm not sure exactly where the source is. I'm sure it's been picked up by a number of sources.
But it was being reported that Ghislaine Maxwell was shacked up with Scott Borgerson, the head of Cargometrics, which is a very interesting company that will
co-founder and CEO.
So we'll delve into that a little bit, and on top of that, and like I said before, we don't want to get obsessed or get stuck on the sort of the front details of is Ghislaine Maxwell staying there? Is she Borgerson's girlfriend? All that kind of stuff. No, we want to look at the meta aspect of this, which is that yes, she knows this guy, and then there's a follow-up article that I believe for sure was in the Telegraph that showed pictures of Christina Maxwell, what I would title one of the Maxwell Talpiot twins that we touched upon last week in the nuclear Epstein program, of Christine Maxwell and Isabel Maxwell, and their obvious background in Israeli connected intelligence connected tech startups, Magellan, Chiliad, and then Chiliad being brought into the highest levels of the FBI's post 9/11 data systems. So there's all of that, and so Christina Maxwell. There's pictures of her in a Telegraph story outside of this area it's called Manchester by the Sea, which is sort of North Coast, North Shore kid, Boston, way up there. Not quite the Gloucester, but past Swamp Scott, Swamp Crotch. It's up in that area. So this is sort of a different area than where Epstein was flying into. But Christina Maxwell had pictures taken of her filling up bags, taking bags of somebody's, probably her sister or someone at least related, at this area of Scott Borgerson's house in Manchester by the Sea. So this is a connection that I think we should delve into now, Greg.
Yes, let's do it. So there's a lot here, and there's a lot of stuff we're just picking up on today with relation to this, to Cargometrics and some number of interesting connections. I guess what I'll start by, and by the way, Cargometrics, as I said, I'm just now starting to get familiar with it. Apparently, it has become Boston-based technology company. According to this article I'm reading here from our FreightWaves.com interview with the CEO, co-founder of Cargometrics, Scott Borgerson. Cargometrics is described as a Boston-based technology company whose big data machine tracks and analyzes global seaborne trade in near real time. And this has tremendous ramifications for for basically any type of travel by sea and the types of cargo, the types of products, things that could be shipped from sea to sea globally. So this is, I think, very, very significant, especially in the digital age.
Yes, and I want to read an article that is connected on the Cargometrics website titled "A Peek Inside Cargometrics Bid to Build the, quote, NSA of Global Trade," unquote, by Greg Miller, senior editor, March 14th, 2018. Quote, "An aura of mystery has long surrounded Cargometrics Technology, a Boston-based quantitative hedge fund that uses ship movement data to place market bets and has secured financial backing from private equity giant Blackstone, famed investor Paul Tudor Jones, Google founder Eric Schmidt, Israeli shipping magnate Idan Ofer, and most recently Maersk Tankers." Okay, let's do an aside here in relationship to, this is a quantitative hedge fund that uses data. That sounds very much like Renaissance Technologies, right? Doesn't it? And Robert Mercer.
Yes,
and that whole background.
Robert Mercer, who of course is the primary funder of the Breitbart media empire, as well as SCL Group and Cambridge Analytica. Anybody who follows our program obviously knows very much what all of that represents, as it definitely ties in, I think, to the whatever bigger picture is going on with all of this. And do you have anything else you want to say before we start talking about these? Before we start talking about the Ofer brothers, or?
Yes, I just want to read a little bit more from this, and I do want to point out that when you're dealing with this idea of like high-speed trading, really quantitative hedge funds, that people like Robert Mercer, and obviously that's what Cargometrics sees itself as when they truck and barter, and that the idea of technology is very much tied to rapidity of information transfer. So we want to in the future look into things like covert operations or the obscuring of acquisitions of specific properties or land, such as places like Mar-a-Lago, where is the landing of data cables. And I think there's something to that. People might want to go look at analyses of the question of what was going on in terms of building on the property there, that there was a dispute between Epstein, right, and Trump down there next to Mar-a-Lago, and then eventually Trump sells, I think, to Rybolovlev, right, the big
yes.
Russian oligarch. I believe he's a fertilizer king of some sort, and that this is a site of the landing of a serious, fiber location.
And Josh Reeves and some of his recent programs on his channel, The Global Reality, has asserted that the Epstein-Trump disputes that are supposed to be at the center of Trump being opposed to all of this criminal sexualizing of underage girls and everything else involved with this whole Epstein network, they're only supposed to believe that like the enemies of Trump are involved in, is that this centers around these disputes over these type of, all of this laundered, mob money that's going into these properties and into these various business endeavors, and that's actually at the root of this, and that would mean that all of this talk of Trump, being enemies with Epstein because Epstein's activities involving the underage is all just a smokescreen. So,
and there's two other examples that I have memory of seeing analyses of in terms of questions about data connections. One was that there's something going on in Alaska related to Robert Mercer that could be potentially about a fast data connection, because when you're dealing with like quants, what they call it, quantitative hedge funds, where it's split second nanoseconds is what gives you the edge that things like stronger connections or closer connections to international data lines become relevant to things like billions of dollars. So that's one thing. And then another thing I saw was this question of last week in terms of nuclear Epstein. We touched on this book that Ghislaine Maxwell was allegedly, reading in this alleged picture from In-N-Out Burger, catty corner to Universal Studios and KPFK and radio station in Los Angeles, written by a guy named Ted Gupp, I think his name was. And he'd written the book or the article that had exposed the underground base for continuity of government for the Congress at the West Virginia Sweetbriar, I think it's called, resort. And then so people should go look into the purchasing of that, and that has a connection to a guy named Justice, a long-term political operative, but then also a tie-in to high levels of Russian oligarchs and these sort of material magnates. So people might want to go look into the background of all this. So I just want to say that so we keep our eyes on some of these kinds of patterns moving forward. And so, I just want to read a little bit more from this article about how Cargometrics seeks to be the NSA of shipping. Okay. All right. So, quote, "We are not a shipping company, we're a technology company," Borgerson told conference attendees. "We're mapping global trade in real time. Today, my company will process hundreds of millions of AIS, automatic identification system positions, from dozens of satellites and thousands of land-based antennas. We have also geotagged hundreds of thousands of terminal berths ourselves, which was a lot of work. We have built a dynamic registry of ships, and we're past shipping. On the west side, for example, we integrate data on pipeline flows, refinery runs, and the weather. What I'm trying to build is the NSA of global trade," he said, referring to America's Information Intelligence Agency, the National Security Agency. Quote, "We have a real-time digital map of the global economy, but more importantly, we have a data archive. More than the patent and the first mover advantage and the dozens of rocket scientists on staff, this is the bigger barrier to entry for a competitor. We save all the data we receive. We have hundreds of billions of historical records in a searchable database. Think of it as a Google search for trade, except it's secret," unquote. And just quickly, in terms of this reference to dozens of rocket scientists, I just want to note that it's this Christina Maxwell who was photographed outside in this area close to Borgerson's Cargometrics CEO co-founder's house, who's married to Roger Molina, who he's just touched on last week, who's the son of Frank Molina, one of the fathers of the U.S. rocketry program, along with people like von Karman, who was tied into the Technion Institute, and who people like Jack Parsons was talking to about working on behalf of the Israeli government for their early rocketry programs. And then there's also this question that I touched on that I will report more on. I have received a book called Escape from Earth, A Secret History of the Space Rocket by Fraser McDonald that goes into more of the background of this question of the U.S. Communist Party Unit 122 that was at believe the man Stanley Weinbaum, I hope that's the right name's house in the area, and all of these guys, including the father of the Chinese nuclear program and the brother of Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the U.S. nuclear program, were all involved in this sort of pre-World War II run up to the U.S. rocket program at Caltech. So there's that whole story there. I just wanted to say that that's in the background here in terms of Christine Maxwell, Roger Molina, Frank Molina, the Maxwell family, the Maxwell Talpiot twins, and all of that, and the deeper background here.
Yes, and that's the U.S., obviously the development of nuclear weapons by the U.S., the Soviet Union responding with their own weapons, and then, of course, as we know, with the events of at least starting in the early 60s, if not earlier, the obvious development of the Israeli nuclear weapons program. So all of that is very much interconnected.
And the Chinese nuclear program, which I believe will start touching on this China angle too here in relationship to Gordon Thomas's book Seeds of Fire. But let's delve into this contact with the Ofer connection here.
Yes, so the Ofer brother. So we're talking about the Ofer brother that was mentioned in this as being a primary investor backer of Cargometrics is Edan Ofer, and Edan Ofer is currently the. Hold on, I'm pulling up. Edan Ofer is the. Just a moment here.
And now, while you're doing that, I just want to report on that the CFR. You remember how Epstein is now reported that Epstein was all up in the mix in the CFR, the Trilateral Commission. Well, Dr. Scott G. Borgerson is the CEO of Cargometrics Technology LLC, has a biography at the CFR that talks all about his background and how much he works on. He's a visiting fellow for ocean governance at the Council on Foreign Relations. He served as a senior research scholar at the School of International Public Affairs at Columbia University, an expert on the Arctic. Dr. Borgerson has published numerous landmark articles on the subject. He advises national and international leaders on emerging Arctic issues, and he is a co-founder of the Arctic Circle, a global NGO. He's a former Coast Guard officer, a patrol boat captain, and the founding managing director of the Academy's Institute for Leadership at the U.S. Coast Guard Academy. And it's interesting here, too, that there is this background of Ghislaine Maxwell in terms of these ocean charities of some sort, right? So you want to actually think about things like the deep state relationship to maritime law, is sort of the way that I might put it, is like the trucking and bartering of a moralless or lawless society is, I think, what is in the background here.
Yes, indeed, and there's some interesting connections with, obviously bringing the Rothschild picture with one of the younger Rothschilds, I believe, being heavily involved in environmental concerns, and then you, of course, think of the connection to the Rothschild family and Jeffrey Epstein as well. So that's something for another time to talk about, but it's there in the picture as well. But anyway, we've got the Ofer brothers are Edan Ofer and Eyal Ofer, and the Ofer brothers are the second generation of Ofers, and now the Ofer brothers are the heads of what used to be known as the Ofer Brothers Group, which is now known as the XT Group. And the Ofer Brothers Group was founded by the brothers Sammy and Yuli Ofer, who were Jews of Romania, born in Romania. And this was established in the 1950s. And then Ofer Holdings, at the Ofer Brothers Group, actually, the Ofer Brothers were given control of the Israel Corporation, which was founded by Shaul Eisenberg, who we've discussed in depth in the past on this program, along with the government of Israel. And after Shaul Eisenberg's death in 1998, the Eisenberg family sold control of the Israel Corporation to the Ofer family. So that's now the Ofer brothers are in direct control of the Israel Corporation, which was started by Shaul Eisenberg. A couple other interesting facts about the Ofer brothers here is that this is an interesting note about the Ofer brothers group, is that just a moment here. An interesting fact is that the Ofer brothers group was actually sanctioned by the U.S. Treasury Department for taking actions that would be considered violating the Iranian sanctions back in, I believe, 2010 or 2011. It was involved in this, I believe, the selling of a submarine or to the Iranian government. So this would be to Iran. This would be interesting to think about in regards to what we've called the concept of the multipolar world, and also the idea of Israel perhaps wanting to at some level wanting to keep Iran armed as a means to keep that to keep alive the imminent threat that Iran is said to pose to Israel's existence, which is a primary justification to continue all of this financial support of Israel, among other things, and the continued tying together of the U.S. and Israeli government. So that's interesting. And one more fact about Edan Ofer is that Edan Ofer hired Black Cube to investigate the finance minister of Israel back in 2014, Yair Lapid, as well as other top Israeli officials. And Yair Lapid has come out as a primary opponent of Benjamin Netanyahu within the Israeli government. And so now we're bringing Black Cube into this. We've got, Ofer and the co-founder of Renaissance Technologies, both having primary investments into cargo work, into Cargometrics, as well as now we're bringing Black Cube into the picture. And we know the various things Black Cube was involved with, of course, investigating Harvey, or basically running surveillance and tracking down alleged victims of Harvey Weinstein, as well as digging up dirt on Iran G5 Iran nuclear deal proponents within the Obama administration. So it's a couple of interesting connections there with the Ofer brothers. But now,
for sure. I mean, the thing about this, I remember seeing their name, the Ofer brothers, when we were more than a year ago, when we were dealing with the background of the SCL group in Cambridge Analytica, which, remember, is of course Mercer. And his deputy, Lieutenant Bannon, is right in the mix and all of that too. But when we were looking at the relationship of Vincent Cengiz, the Iranian Jew who's established in the UK, just like the Eyal Ofer, and I believe both the Ofer brothers have a deep connection to London, right? The city of London, right? The Rothschilds' headquarters. I remember seeing them in the background of the SCL group, Cambridge Analytica, and it's interesting we've bumped into them again here. And I think what you pointed out about this background of Shaul Eisenberg, of course, in terms of the Israel Corporation, which was, like you said, state-based. It's largely state-based, but then there was always the question of who, Shaul Eisenberg's role. Was he answering to the Israeli intelligence, or was Israeli intelligence answering to him? And of course, his main claim to fame was he really opened up the East in relationship to Israel. He's the one who did some of these really early official but covert business relationship between the highest levels of Israeli technology and military leadership with the Chinese government. But he was also Japan-based, and so it's interesting that his sons, and like Idan, for example, is Hong Kong, Singapore based, so very, very Eastern, very Asian connections here, and then Ayal in relationship to is Monaco based, right?
Yes,
and so it's an interesting combination here in terms of all of this. But the Israel Corporation,
Ofer also served as an intelligence officer in the Israeli Air Force from 1967 to 1973, which means that he was serving as intel within the Israeli Air Force during the time of both the USS Liberty bombing as well as the Yom Kippur War of 73, where basically Israel was saved thanks to an emergency shipment of weapons from the Nixon administration.
Right, and there's a naval commander and an Israeli Air Force intelligence officer, right? I think one of them is each. So that's interesting. And then the last thing I did want to mention was that when you're talking about the Israel Corporation, you're talking about the holder of groups such as Israeli Chemical Limited, which is one of the biggest phosphorus, think like white phosphorus even, but also a fertilizer in the world, I believe, but also Zim Shippings, right? Is the state shipping company of Israel, which was, of course, connected. It's one of the most blatant pieces of evidence of apparent Israeli state knowledge of September 11th, and that the Zim Shipping skipped out and lost dozens of thousands of dollars in rent by skedaddling out of their World Trade Center offices in the days to weeks ahead of September 11th, rather than finishing it out for a few more months. So I think that once again we're seeing this epicenter around September 11th.
Yes, and Zim Shipping was a primary player in the purchasing of ships by Israel that was going on at the time in the early 50s, during the time when Israel and West Germany had made settlements over the Holocaust and reparations, and in that time period as well, which of course we know that German basically funding and financing of Israeli naval ships has played a key role, and I think a lot of Israeli military prowess over the years as well. And then one more thing about the Ofer brothers, I wanted to verify this sanctions that were put on the Ofer brothers by the U.S. State Department, not the Treasury Department, for violating the Iranian sanctions regime. According to the State Department, an Ofer subsidiary based in Singapore had sold a ship to Iran in 2010, and then Benjamin Netanyahu's office has denied allegations that the company's dealings in Iran had been authorized by the State of Israel. So that's very interesting.
So let's delve in. I really want to try to get back to September 11th and this question of Epstein, Teterboro, and this Boston area, and the Hanscom Air Force Base, and MITRE and PTEC and all of that. But let's delve while we're at it, and we're picking up on these connections between the highest levels of Israeli industrial oligarchs to Asia in the background here, specifically as we're seeing it right now play out in relationship to the ongoing Epstein investigation, Maxwell, the Maxwell family, the Maxwell Talpiot twin sisters, their husbands, all of that. Let's delve in a little bit to this relationship between China and Israel and intelligence operations against the United States, and how high level it is and what it might mean. And there's also a few things in here that'll touch on what we've already been talking about. So this is an interesting book, Gordon Thomas's book, Seeds of Fire, China and the Story Behind the Attack on America. And what's interesting, just briefly delving into it, and we read through some of this early pages yesterday when we were researching, and there is a lot in here actually that I believe is based upon probably years, if not decades, of Gordon Thomas's sources and connections and investigations into these key pieces of things like of the Promise software, Enhanced Promise, of Maxwell, of the Sandia Labs, the penetration of Israeli intelligence. But this one then ties in China to all of that, which is very interesting.
And before you start reading, it's interesting that we're finding all this information from Gordon Thomas's book Seeds of Fire. Of course, I think that rightly so, and I think it's a very positive development that Gordon Thomas's book Israel Super Spy on Robert Maxwell has gained some traction certainly within the alternative media in the wake of the Epstein arrest and then alleged suicide or whatever happened there, and the whole Maxwell family connection to that. But also, Gordon Thomas has this book as well as Gideon Spies, which is a history of basically of Israeli spying and espionage operations. It was written in the late 90s, where the allegations of Monica Lewinsky being being basically a Mossad agent within the White House were published among the findings in that book. So while we've got Gordon Thomas, his book posthumously is getting a lot of traction now, these other books I think in some ways are just as important. And it's interesting that there's so much information about this Israeli angle within the book Seeds of Fire, because we're starting to look into this which is a book about China. And it's interesting because with regards to China, one thing that we're trying to do among ourselves is try to make sense of some of what's going on with all of this, particularly from the right wing in America, this saber rattling against China and this building up of China as basically the modern day Soviet Union. And there's a lot going on right now in China that I don't want to get into in terms of domestic politics and Hong Kong protests and trying to make sense of who stands on what side. But something that I'm beginning to more and more consider the possibility of when you think about the multipolar world and the shift from the West to the East is that a lot of this is indeed manufactured. And while you have this portrayal of China as this serious enemy, meanwhile, I think that a lot of the people who are pushing this threat are at the very least keeping silent, at the very worst, or even more complicit at some level in China and this close relationship developing between China and Israel, and a Chinese role in a lot of espionage operations and selling out and outsourcing of U.S. The most sensitive military technological secrets of the U.S. government. So I just wanted to throw that prelude into what we're going to be reading from here.
Yes, well, thank you for that. And it made me think of it like that. that I remember just a few months ago, and I think this is important for us to remember about how fast things are moving in terms of the analysis that we might have to do and help lead the way intellectually, if we can, in terms of refocusing people on what really matters here. Is just a few months ago, we would go to the central branch of the Kansas City Public Library, and I would have no doubt that when I looked up the book Israel Super Spy, Robert Maxwell, Israel Super Spy, that it would be there, and it was an obscure book. But now here we are, just a few months later, and that book is at the epicenter of what you can imagine is dozens, if not hundreds, if not thousands of people's investigations now, including mainstream journalists and independent analysts into who Robert Maxwell, the father of Ghislaine Maxwell, Jeffrey Epstein's partner in his organized crime spree, and the network that he involves. All of that. So I think it's just it's important for us to remember of how rapidly this is evolving, and that we need to stay focused on the truth to guide us forward here. So let me read a little bit from these early pages of Seeds of Fire, China and the Story Behind the Attack on America by Gordon Thomas. I mean, we have to remember Gordon Thomas, he's got his own angle here. He's obviously got some. I believe he's deceased now, but I'm sure he had strong connections, obviously, to certain aspects of intelligence communities, very likely high levels of UK MI6. But meanwhile, this information here is very interesting. So I'm going to just read a little bit from.
Gordon Thomas died in March of 2017, by the way.
So page 23, quote, George Tenet also knew that though Lee had not been a CSIS spy, by the way, he's talking about the Wenho Lee, the allegations against Wenho Lee as being part of a Chinese spy operation. And
yes, Chinese scientist who worked at Los Alamos, I believe, and this happened in the late 90s when the scandal took place.
And this is interesting because Wenho Lee begins to look like a scapegoat for these higher levels of this conjunction of Israeli intelligence and Chinese. But we'll read it and it'll come out. That Lee had not been George Tenet also knew that though Lee had not been a CSIS spy, China's Secret Intelligence Service had carried out its penetration of Los Alamos almost certainly with the help of another foreign intelligence service. On paper, that service was deemed to be the closest of all friendly intelligence agencies to the American intelligence community. The service was Mossad, the external intelligence agency of Israel. When Tenet had come into office, he had read two documents written by his predecessors. The first was penned by William Casey on March 21st, 1984. Quote, a nation creates the intelligence community it needs. America relies on technical expertise because we are concerned to discover rather than secretly rule. The Israelis operate differently. Mossad in particular equates its actions with its nation's survival, unquote. The second document was written by Robert Michael Gates, a mere week after he became director of the CIA on December 15, 1986. Quote, Mossad's most celebrated director, Meir Amit, has said that the Mossad should live by the credo, Israel first, last, and always. Always. We must never be caught going through the pockets of our friends. The key word is caught, unquote. Commenting on that adage, Gates had detailed Mossad's increased penetration of the United States through economic, scientific, and technological espionage. A special Israeli unit codenamed AL, A-L, Hebrew for above. An aside, does that sound like above Israeli intelligence, potentially? So what's the relationship of Mega and Al?
Yeah, and you look up Al, do a Google search for Al in Israeli, you won't find anything. It's very interesting.
This is the only reference that I can find to it on the record, really.
And just like Mega was previously obscure up until recently, now we'll see if anything can be dug up on this in the future. We'll see.
So especially Israeli unit codenamed Al, Hebrew for above, had been set up to prowl through California's Silicon Valley and Boston's Route 128 for high-tech secrets. In his report to the Senate Intelligence Committee, another of Tenet's predecessors, Bobby Ray Inman, had identified Israel as one of 6 foreign nations with a, quote, government-directed, orchestrated, and clandestine effort to steal U.S. military and economic secrets, unquote. Tenet had not forgotten that another on the list was China. Now, though he still could not prove it in a way that a court of law would demand proof, he was very certain that the Los Alamos operation had been a joint venture between Mossad and CSIS. For China, the accruing benefits had been easy to understand, access to secrets that no other country possessed. For Israel, those secrets were also beyond price. But to share them with China, Israel had demanded an extra price, access to other technology that China was developing, which would give Israel a lead over its Arab neighbors in such vital areas as agriculture, water desalination, and the other requirements that would ensure the country would continue to prosper and blossom in the arid landscape of their forefathers. Israel would also receive China's latest weapons technology, as advanced as that of the United States. George Tenet, so his friends later said, had thought long and hard about how much of all of this he should reveal to the Bush transition team. Those same friends had no doubt that as his limousine eased its way through the traffic on its 9-mile journey into Washington, the question would still be uppermost in his mind, unquote. And so this whole section is talking about like the Tenet's, what Tenet is going to brief the incoming George W. Bush administration on in terms of his own concerns. I just want to make one point, is that I read that it appeared that until John O'Neill looks like he sort of got framed for a stealing of his briefcase, very likely by someone interested in what he knew about the involvement of Israeli intelligence networks surrounding Manhattan in the run-up to 9/11, that he was apparently in the running for the position of the national security, the counterterrorism-focused national security advisor that Richard Clarke held during the Clinton administration and then went over into the W. Bush administration. And I pointed out that I believe there's a troika of dicks surrounding September 11th, Dick Clark, Dick Pearl, and Dick Cheney.
Very good. I wouldn't argue with that. And real quick, with regards to Tenet, we're not going to go into this. I just want to throw this in with Tenet and this information that he was putting out, that he was contemplating giving to the Bush administration regarding all of this historical information, is that Tenet and the CIA were very much seen. Tenet CIA, even though Tenet ultimately, as you mentioned with Colin Powell, ultimately made the Iraq War possible via the whole, the UN speech about anthrax and all of that. But I mean, it is Tenet CIA was considered hostile by the real hardcore elements within operating out of Cheney circles that were pushing the primary post 9/11 propaganda of the war on terror, not just the Iraq War, but the overall war on terror. And it's interesting in regards to Michael Maloof at RT's former Feith Wormser direct associate, his anger, it seems, at the Tenet gang and that the CIA was motivated by political partisanship to ignore the findings of Maloof, Wormser, and Feith and company. And so and so how much of this is related to an element within the intelligence agencies that are very much, as we know, a lot of the U.S. Establishment intelligence has been in national security has very much been very hostile, or at least has tried to push back against a lot of this Israeli influence in terms of Israeli domination in a lot of areas from a very hardcore Zionist perspective. And so how much of this continued hostility towards the deep state and these elements of the CIA is related to this history here, and of this perceived hostility to the findings of these heroic people post September 11th. So I just had to throw that in there with regards to Tenet. Okay, and in our last 5 minutes, I'll just try to get through this next section of this book, which is interesting, that the other concern that Tenet apparently had that he didn't know whether to brief the incoming administration on was, one we've already established was this question of Israeli intelligence involvement with China in severe penetrations of U.S. national security apparatus, specifically the nuclear network.
But then the other one is the involvement of the Ukrainian-centric Russian Jewish organized crime mobs surrounding people like Semyon Mogilevich in relationship to the trucking and bartering of nuclear materials globally, including other things. Now, I never knew that this is what was front and foremost on DCI Tenet's mind as the incoming W. Bush administration was seeking his continued service. But I guess that's what was going on. So that is very, very interesting. And when you say that, Greg, in terms of this question of the deep state and the question of, the sort of mass of CIA and all that, it reminds me of the Gary Vogler book and the show we did about that, about the war for Iraq war for oil for Israel, and how this is someone who was close to it and did not figure out what was actually going on until many years later, and then he was able to piece together, that's why Douglas Feith was overriding Department of Defense security clearance concerns with people like Michael Mokovsky, the eventual head of Jewish Institute of National Security Affairs, to oversee the post-Iraq oil scenario, and realized that Mokovsky had been sent to Israel for the Foreign Service for 5 years and was thus obviously Israeli intelligence. So there in the background here, I think more and more people are going to discover how powerful this Israeli influence, and we might even say colonization or domination of this level of our security politics really is. But I'll just read a little bit more through this, Greg, if that's okay, and then we'll just
yes, and this will probably take up through the rest of our time here. But whatever we don't get into, we recommend certainly Seeds of Fire, and reading this information for anybody who themselves wants to dig deeper in this. But we'll get what we can out of these last few minutes here.
Okay, so here's page 25 where it's talking about what the other papers that Tenet wants to brief on. Quote, 2 of the documents concern the Russian mafia. The first dealt with the mafia's relationship with the Mossad. It contained the revelation that the Israeli agency could soon be asked to move its European headquarters in Holland following highly embarrassing claims that Mossad had been secretly buying plutonium and other nuclear materials from the Russian mafia. The allegation had come from a CIA agent in Amsterdam who had picked it up from Intel, the small but formidable division of Dutch intelligence. Intel operated from a deep bunker near Amsterdam's Central Railway Station. The bunker had ironically been built to shelter the Dutch royal family in the event of Soviet nuclear attack on the city at the height of the Cold War. The CIA agent's report said that the most of the nuclear material had been stolen by the mafia from Russian weapons labs such as Chelyabinsk 70 in the Ural Mountains and Arsama 16 in the Nizhny Novgorod, formerly Gorky. Senior Mossad officers had insisted to Intel that precisely because the deadly materials were stolen, their agents had purchased them from the Russian mafia. It was the only sure way to stop the materials from being sold to Islamic and other terror groups. While conceding that the Mossad claim was plausible, Intel investigators had become convinced that the nuclear materials had been secretly shipped out of Amsterdam's Schiphol airport to boost Israel's own nuclear weapons manufacturing plant at Dimona in the Negev desert. Already stockpiled there were an estimated 200 nuclear weapons. For Tenet, knowing Mossad was trafficking with the Russian mafia had rekindled a nuclear nightmare that had never quite gone away. So this, we're not going to be able to get to all this, but I just want to point out that people didn't believe that explanation by Israeli intelligence about this material. And I would point out, we'll link to some stories on Veterans Today that basically say that Colonel Jim Hankey, who was in Israel, had seen that in the late 80s, early 90s, that Dimona had already gone critical and that they were not able to produce their indigenous nuclear weapons material. And so this is obviously what Israeli intelligence was actually doing. And my question is that what ended up in terms of ground zero on September 11th? So until next week, Greg, Antidote, we out.
All right, till next time.